Welcome. This is the Letcher County Extension Show, and I'm your host, Shad Baker, and you are looking at cucumbers being grown in a high tunnel on the fertile banks of Rockhouse Creek here in Letcher County. And you never know what you're going to see in Letcher County. James and I were talking about it earlier. Folks would never think that this was actually being produced here. And this is May the 22nd. So it is very early in the year. Nobody that would be growing at home would have anything like this. These high tunnels really allow you to get things started early. So we've been talking about doing a show on this, and it's really to give people an idea of what they can do, and that this is very doable. This isn't something that is hard to do or make-believe. This is something that you can actually do here in Letcher County. And we started off with just a handful of people that had an interest in doing these, and this year there were 13 new people that acquired new high tunnels here in the county. So the hope is that pretty soon there will be a lot more production out of high tunnels, and we wanted to let the general public know about it, and maybe encourage some people that have been thinking about high tunnels or extending their growing season to consider this and to show them what's involved. So we're going to talk first about why these things have come on in the county, and a lot of what's been driving it is the farmers market. We've got a good outlet for the produce, and we've got demand for people that want produce that's locally grown, and they want it earlier in the growing season. And so a high tunnel allows that to happen. You can start having things come out of a high tunnel usually in early March, and you compare that to a garden where you might not have anything until early May. So it really adds a lot. And then on the back side of the season, you can start, most folks that are producing in a garden, their stuff's going to start to fizzle out in August and September. Maybe if they manage their disease and insect problems, they might have things into early October, but in a high tunnel, you can have things deep into November or even later. So there's a real reason to consider these. And we're going to talk about what a high tunnel actually is. Sometimes people think, well, that's a greenhouse. And the difference between a greenhouse and a high tunnel is a greenhouse is heated, and so it's climate controlled in that sense. A high tunnel doesn't have a heater in it. A high tunnel, you're just using the heat that's trapped from the sunlight that's naturally occurring. And there's no supplemental lighting in these. So a greenhouse is going to have extra greenhouse lighting in it. And this, you might notice here in a second that there's no supplemental light. It's all what's just naturally coming in. But what it does is it uses the heat and the sunlight that's here, and it traps the heat so it stays warmer later in the year. Now, heat isn't the only thing that affects how plants grow. It's a function of how much sunlight they're getting. So you can have a plant in a totally warm environment, but if it's not getting enough sunlight, it's not going to grow very good. So there are limitations. You can't grow in a high tunnel year-round. Not all crops anyway. You can get away with growing spinach or some things that would make it through the winter on low light conditions, but if you ever saw a graph of what the sunlight intensity does in Kentucky, it really starts falling off in October, and as it falls off, the plants slow down and they grow really, really slow. And so a lot of times what that would mean is you can carry a plant through the winter, but it won't produce necessarily what you're wanting to produce with it. I'll take broccoli as an example. If you had broccoli in a high tunnel, it would carry through the winter, but you wouldn't expect to get the big full heads like what you're looking for. But what it would do is, because it's carried it through the winter and kept it alive, it's going to, when the sunlight starts picking back up again, that plant's going to take off, and you're going to have broccoli heads way early in a high tunnel compared to growing out in the field. So I know I chased after a rabbit there, but I'll move on to some other things. So you're using the native soil here. In some greenhouses, they'll grow things up on a table, or they'll have them in pots. Typically in a high tunnel, they're going to be using the soil that's naturally in the field. So you can't try this just anywhere. It needs to be somewhere that has good soil already. And in this one, I don't know if you can look at it. James will divert the camera down, but there's actually fabric on the ground, and that's keeping the weeds down, so that he's not having to come in here and do a lot of weed control, because weeds will grow in this just like they would out in the field. And so that's why he's using the fabric for. And some of you might also be asking, well, what do you do about the rainfall? Because the fabric on the plastic is going to keep the rain from coming in. If you do a high tunnel, you have to fertigate or irrigate. And so he's using a trickle type irrigation. And you can look down, he's got tubing that's coming through, and usually there will be little emitters that are coming out of this and going next to the plants. You can see this tubing here. That's just like a flexible tape, but that is hollow on the inside, and that's allowing the water, and sometimes it's water mixed with fertilizer, that's coming down and feeding these plants. And so I want to show you a couple of things of what he's got. You can see he's got cucumbers here, and the cucumbers are in bloom. And if you've grown cucumbers before, you know that they have to be pollinated. And so I already asked how they were being pollinated, and I see one little wild bee flying around right now. But this particular owner actually has bumblebees that are coming in, and bumblebees will come into a high tunnel and work and find their way back out. The honeybees get confused. They want to go up. And so when honeybees get in here, they get stuck a lot of times, and they don't know how to get back out. But a bumblebee seems to be able to figure out how to get back out of it and go back to the hive. So he's also got some beans on the back side of these. He's got beans that are blooming, and I might back up just a little bit. I don't know if you can see this or not, but I'll try to pull some of these out where James can show you. If you can see that, there's actually green beans that are already here on the vines, and those are getting really close to time to harvest. And so again, this is May the 22nd. And the fact that you could have beans ready to pick in May means that you're going to get a price out of those that a regular farmer wouldn't get. People are willing to pay more for something if they get it at a time that they can't get it anywhere else. So this is kind of a unique thing. And if you're wanting to grow things and you can get a premium on the price, that's the incentive for you to give this a try. Now, it also speeds up the maturity. It's not just that you're getting an earlier start or that you get to grow it later. Because it's warmer in here and the conditions are optimal for the plants, they actually grow faster. So if you've got a bean that would normally be an 80-day bean, it might be a 70 or a 65-day bean in a high tunnel. And so you've got a faster turnaround to be able to get that to market. And that's a good thing about it. It also eliminates some issues. Because you're controlling the water that's coming in, you are going to have, on certain diseases, you're going to have less disease pressure. So, you know, things where your blights and things that like wet leaves, they grow really fast on wet leaves. In this tunnel, you're not going to have wet leaves. All the water is coming in from the roots, so you're going to have less disease pressure from that sense. But now, it's not all roses. There are some things that you've got to worry about. We mentioned the pollinators. You know, that's a special management thing. And trying to make sure that it doesn't get too hot. I don't know if you can see it through the camera, but up on the roof of this, it's not just clear plastic, he's got shade cloth on it. If you've got a really hot sunny day, it can get too hot in the high tunnel. And so you have to put shade fabric on it to try to keep the temperature down. And then the little walls on the sides of it can be rolled up. He's got the sidewalls up today, and that's because it's supposed to be really warm. And if you don't manage the temperature pretty close, it can get too hot and cook your beans or cook what you're trying to produce. So this is, it's not a lazy man's thing. This isn't something that you can get it going and then you just walk away from it. This requires more management than something out in the field does, because you have to be concerned about things that you wouldn't out in the field, but you're making more money from it. So that's why you would consider it. Not all crops that you would think about growing out in the field are going to be worthwhile in a high tunnel. You're going to want to grow things in here that are higher value crops, so that you're justifying the expense. You know, when you put down fabric, that costs money. When you put in irrigation lines, that costs money. When you're having to do things with the plastic or whatever, all those things cost money. So you have to think about, what kinds of crops am I going to produce? Are people going to be willing to pay enough extra for to justify the expense that I'm getting into here? So some of the ones, tomatoes are really popular in high tunnels. That's probably your #1 cash crop in a high tunnel is a tomato, because people pay a lot for tomatoes. He's doing beans in here, and he's happy, I guess, or he wouldn't be doing that. But typically people would tell you that there are some crops, greens are going to be good, you know, lettuce and those kinds of things. People will pay a lot and you don't have a lot of money in them. So that would be a good crop for this, but not everything is ideally suited. And we've got a calendar that Extension put out that's got some different crops, and it lists what their temperature requirement is, and it also, you can kind of look at the bars there, and it will tell you when you would plant them and when you would transplant, if you were starting them from seed or if you were transplanting them in here. And then the blue would be when you would harvest. And so what you would try to do is stagger different things that you've got in, so that you don't have everything coming off all at once. You want to have it so that you might have one row here of tomatoes that you started on one date, and then maybe some later ones, or a different crop altogether that comes in later. But you can kind of arrange to plant different things. We've got spinach, Swiss chard, beets, parsley, carrots, cabbage, mustard greens, turnips, radishes, basil, lettuce, green onions, bulb onions, strawberries, cucumbers, summer squash, melons, bell peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, beans, and peas. Those are all the typical crops that would be grown in a high tunnel. And some of it's a function of what pays for itself, but some of it is what can grow when the light intensity is low. And so that's the reason why you would pick some of these. And anyway, we've got copies of this at the office if you want to look at it and give it a little thought. But I'm going to talk about just some of the other things here in the high tunnel. And we're going to take a break and relocate to the other side, and we'll be right back. So be sure to stay with us. Welcome back to the Letcher County Extension Show. I'm your host, Shad Baker, and we are out here in a high tunnel on the fertile banks of Rockhouse Creek in Letcher County, Kentucky, God's country. And we're talking about high tunnels and why a person might be interested in giving this a try. And most of the material that I'm going to be using